Welcome to History for Granite. Join me to explore ancient Egypt. Please subscribe, and together we'll uncover secrets from the past, written in stone. Investigating the ancient past does not always bring about solutions that are satisfying or conclusive. Often the best we can hope for is a probable explanation matching the few bits of evidence we can observe today. An unfortunate side effect is that many investigators simply give up the search once a reasonable and widely accepted idea takes hold. The history then becomes taken for granted, and what was once a reasonable supposition is repeated until it's considered to be fact. In this video, we are going to upend one of the most famous stories told of the Giza plateau, the story of the Great Breach in the north face of Menkaure's Pyramid. I will use this opportunity to correct some of my own mistakes in previous videos and present a more robustly accurate account of the destruction of the Giza pyramids. In my earliest work on this channel, I challenged conventional wisdom that the Great Breach was an attempt at dismantling Menkaure's pyramid. The physical evidence of the breach seemed incompatible with the demolition attempt. Nobody would try to dismantle a pyramid by cutting a thin slice into one side. The breach centered on the north face also corresponded to where intruders would search for an entrance if they had entered other pyramids at Giza. All Old Kingdom pyramids have their entrances in the same location. My earlier proposal was that intruders were attempting to locate a hidden chamber at the end of Menkaure's upper corridor, which dead ends into the rough core of the pyramid. Given the hazards and challenges of digging through the core of a pyramid, I proposed digging from the outside would be a preferable method of attack, especially considering that Menkaure's pyramid is much smaller than its neighbors. The central problem to this mystery is that the author al-Latif al-Baghdadi describes an attempt to destroy Menkaure's pyramid by Sultan Uthman in 1196 AD. al-Latif is considered one of the most reliable testimonies about Egypt of his era. It is unknown if he would have personally witnessed this event, but he was a royal patron of the Sultan and privy to information about such things. I previously tried to reconcile al-Latif's account by suggesting the destruction attempt was merely a cover story for treasure hunting. His report also states the demolition attempt took 8 months, which seems excessive for the apparent damage we see today. What had not occurred to me during my previous analysis was that al-Latif's account of Menkaure's pyramid may have been almost entirely fabricated. The reason for this oversight on my part is that every Egyptology publication references the 1196 attack as if it were an established fact. I assumed there must have been other corroborating evidence to back up this story, but there is actually none to be found. The only connection to be made is that Menkaure's pyramid has a gash on one side, and al-Latif's account says only one side was damaged in the demolition attempt. After making my video on this topic years ago, other researchers followed up with different ideas, namely that most of the Great Breach was due to a treasure hunt closer to the end of the 18th century. The YouTube channel Wallace's Mysteries of Antiquity made some videos about it, and independent researcher Lawrence Van Vliet also contributed sources and analysis on this topic. I recommend both creators as talented investigators of ancient Egypt. Wallace and Van Vliet keenly observed that none of the European visitors to Giza in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries make any mention of the Great Breach, despite many detailed descriptions of Menkaure's pyramid. This absence was difficult to explain, however, I still couldn't find a better reason for the damage. Explorers from the French occupation in 1798 were told by local Egyptians that Murad Bey was responsible for the Great Breach. Jacques Grobert of the French occupation describes the Great Breach as an excavation about 10 feet deep and draws it from a distance. Wallace presented this as evidence the breach was much smaller back in 1798. He considers perhaps the later ruler Osman Bey may be responsible for most of the damage, as suggested by John Perring back in 1839. Perring may also have been referring to al-Latif's account, which had recently been translated to French, as Uthman and Osman can be interchangeable variants of the same name, and Bey is the title of a local ruler. Here's where things start to get complicated, and I'll give you an amusing summary of how confounding this research can really be. If it was simply a matter of reading old accounts of Giza and finding the right author with a ready-made solution, this mystery would have been solved long ago. Unfortunately, most visitors only spend a single day at the pyramids, and everyone brings different perspectives on what they are seeing and how they choose to describe it. Using casing stones as an example, some travelers label the granite casing basalt, while others call it marble. Some travelers mistake limestone for marble, and some even confuse casing stones for cement. Some visitors report smooth casing stones can be climbed, while others insist climbing them is completely impossible. Some claim Khafre's stripped pyramid cannot be scaled, yet others climb it without trouble, and there are even conflicting opinions about different sections of that same pyramid. And with so many visitors focusing their attention on the Great Pyramid, how climbable something feels is often the only real descriptor left for the other two pyramids on the plateau. Few explorers prior to the French occupation in 1798 realized the Giza pyramids had once all been covered in smooth casing stones, even when two of them still retained most of that outer facing. Early visitors, already biased toward seeing the Great Pyramid as the largest and most magnificent sight, actually believed its rough core was a decorative stepped feature that looked more impressive than the nearby pyramids still covered in smooth intact stone. When turning their travel notebooks into printed publications, some authors would copy details straight from earlier books and rarely admit they were doing so. Some writers also failed to separate stories told to them by local guides from their own direct first-hand observations. A handful of travel accounts are even fully plagiarized from other works, with authors that may well have been entirely fictional people. Most of these visitor accounts were never printed in English and rely on translation work, and key facts can shift between different later editions or translated versions of the same text. And we had better not get into the challenges of optical character recognition working from old German print fonts. Getting the facts lined up correctly feels a lot like the board game Clue, where no single witness can hand you a clear, straight answer. You have to infer what each person actually knew and how they came to know it by cross-examining every available source. Written words can easily be misread and misinterpreted, and even period drawings have to be carefully scrutinized to understand what accurate information they really convey. Circling back to Wallace's video covering Grobert's drawing and written description of the Great Breach from 1798, I do not believe Grobert witnessed a significantly smaller breach than what we see today. That large cut would fill rapidly with wind-blown sand and debris, something much clearer in higher quality drawings made during the 1830s. Grobert had no way to dig down inside that damaged opening, so he could only guess its true depth based on the exposed upper section. He had no idea how deeply the whole feature was buried under accumulated sand, and he would never have suspected just how substantial that gash really was. The drawing Wallace shared came from a low-resolution digital scan, which made close inspection very difficult. A full-resolution copy reveals wavy, cross-hatched lines sitting below the top edge of the exposed breach, which I interpret to represent piled sand. If that dark triangular shape was the only damaged portion on Menkaure's pyramid face, sand could not build up there any differently from anywhere else on the structure. If that area had remained undamaged, loose sand and rubble would simply slide off just like it does on the pyramid's other sides. The large pile of fallen debris at the pyramid's base is clearly marked in those old drawings on its western face. Grobert was observing the exact same damage John Perring documented in 1837, with most of the breach filled deep under sand. There are plenty of other examples showing how carefully Giza's old illustrations need to be checked to avoid landing on wrong conclusions. George Sandys toured Giza in 1611 and published his drawing 4 years later. This was before Khafre's pyramid lost its casing stones, yet his illustration is somewhat sloppy around the pyramid's top section. Combine that with poor quality reprints of the artwork, and what was originally just smudged ink slowly morphed in later copies to look like Khafre's pyramid after its outer casing had been torn away, because the summit's appearance looks so different. The sketch printed on the cover of one official Egyptology reprint of Sandy's book amplifies this misleading visual trick. At this point, you might reasonably ask, can we really confirm the casing stones were removed after George Sandys' 1611 visit? Rest assured, Sandy's own writing is unambiguous on this point, describing the pyramid as smooth on the outside and impossible to enter. Other visitors coming after George Sandys left distinct matching observations about those casing stones, so we can cross-verify his testimony. Corneille le Bruyn visited Giza in 1681, by which time Khafre's casing stones had already been looted away. His original sketch shows a faint dividing line separating the casing stones still left at the summit from the stripped stonework below. Unfortunately, later reprinted copies of his illustration erase that fine detail, making it far harder to read exactly what he originally drew. It almost feels as though history itself is trying to confuse us about exactly when those outer casing stones were stripped from that pyramid. With all that background laid out, let me address some errors I made in my earlier video covering this subject. The core arguments from that video still hold up completely, yet I got a couple of dates wrong when pinpointing when Khafre's limestone casing stones were stolen. Since I've asked viewers to help track down where those reused stones ultimately ended up, accurate timelines are extremely important. The first and most meaningful mistake was crediting one drawing to Jean de Thévenot from 1664. In truth, that illustration was published that same year by his uncle Melchizedek Thévenot, who compiled travel accounts from multiple people who had journeyed to Egypt, including his nephew Jean. Jean de Thévenot traveled to Giza around 1657, though we cannot even be certain he personally created that specific drawing. Melchizedek Thévenot referenced many different writers, including Jacques de Villemont, George Sandys, Johann Helffrich, Albert Lowenstein, and Sebastiano Serlio, but much of the material he printed traces back to John Greaves. The sketch we are discussing sits grouped alongside other artwork with no named creator attached. The large drawing showing the Great Pyramid does not appear in any other known source, yet the measurements printed alongside it originate with John Greaves. The sketch depicting the Great Pyramid's entrance comes from George Sandys, mirrored and with small alterations applied. That realization helped me understand the surviving drawing of Khafre's pyramid with intact casing stones was also mirrored, and it should be oriented so the damage sits on its north face. On top of that, rock-cut tombs only exist along the western cliff, which confirms that corrected orientation is right. Once flipped, that mysterious old sketch strongly resembles drawings published by John Greaves, making him the most likely original artist. This means we can only safely confirm Khafre's casing stones were still fully intact in 1639, not 1664. My second mistake was failing to double-check the travel dates for Vincent Stokove, who witnessed Khafre with its smooth outer casing still present. Stokove actually visited Giza in 1631. That pushes our possible window for when the casing stones got stolen wider, falling somewhere between 1639 and 1678. The embarrassment from getting these dates wrong pushed me to correct these errors, and that process ultimately guided me toward solving the riddle of Menkaure's Great Breach. As it turns out, the limestone casing covering Khafre and Menkaure's pyramids was stolen not long after John Greaves' visit in 1639. Most telling of all, Gabriel Bremond arrived in 1643 and wrote about Khafre's pyramid, noting its exterior was totally ruined, and in such poor shape you could not climb to the summit from any side. Balthazar de Monconis also visited in 1647 and wrote how the smaller pyramid, barely smaller than its larger neighbor and standing just a short distance away, was heavily ruined and appeared built so that climbing it was impossible. What exactly counted as climbable remains ambiguous, as I mentioned before, yet both men independently describing the pyramids as wrecked gives solid evidence the casing stones were already gone, leaving them looking much like how they appear today. I overlooked these two sources in my earlier analysis because neither writer explicitly talked about casing stones by name, but their general observations align far better with a stripped-down pyramid than one still covered in its original smooth outer layer. This is a very useful breakthrough. The theft of those casing stones can now be pinned down to a narrow window between April of 1639 and November of 1643. There is, however, another important consequence from Khafre's casing stones getting stripped away which I had not considered previously. While looters pried off those massive outer blocks, they would inevitably stumble across the pyramid's original entrance and venture inside its passages. Only one granite portcullis blocked access to the inner chambers, and that barrier could easily be pried upward by work crews already experienced at moving thousands upon thousands of heavy casing stones. Historical context matters greatly here. Before this event, there was no written record or common local knowledge telling people Khafre's pyramid contained inner chambers and passageways. Some visitors might guess it held an entrance similar to the Great Pyramid, but that was nothing more than speculation. Once a pyramid's entrance got buried under mounds of drifted sand, people avoided digging through heavy sand as an exploration strategy. For that reason, the entryways for Khafre and Menkaure may have stayed hidden for thousands of years. Critical evidence for this casing stone looting and the forced entry into Khafre's pyramid after 1639 comes from one detail inside Gabriel Bremond's 1643 account that appears nowhere else in surviving texts. Bremond writes that many small pyramids dot the landscape, and among them sits one comparable in size to the Great Pyramid which you can now enter, though the descent is dangerous. The passage is steep and littered with loose stones that could seal the exit if sections collapse. Word had it this pyramid held two chambers stacked one above the other. Khafre's pyramid had been opened shortly before Bremond showed up, so local residents could recount that break-in and accurately describe its two stacked inner chambers. Shortly after Bremond's visit, sand and rubble once again buried over that entrance, and it would stay hidden for more than a full century. Bremond's own writings were not published until the 20th century, so no earlier researchers could read his words and realize Khafre's entrance had already been rediscovered long before. On March 2nd of 1818, Giovanni Belzoni would become the first person to step foot inside Khafre's burial chamber since Gabriel Bremond's time. Belzoni copied charcoal Arabic graffiti scrawled onto those chamber walls, and its translation tells us master stonecutter Muhammad Ahmed opened these spaces, with Master Uthman present for the work and King Ali Muhammad overseeing everything from start to finish. These are most likely three key figures behind the looting of limestone casing stones from Khafre and Menkaure's pyramids, operating within that 1639 to 1643 window. When Belzoni found this graffiti, historians had no idea when that break-in had taken place, and many grew confused by the mention of King Ali Muhammad, whose name could not be found anywhere within surviving Arabic historical records. That uncertainty even cast doubt over whether the graffiti itself was authentic. Fortunately, Belzoni was not the only explorer to document that wall writing. Edward William Lane, British explorer and Arabic translator, visited Khafre's pyramid in 1820, while parts of the graffiti could still be read before it faded away completely. He noted some lines were already illegible, but could make out that the word interpreted as king was actually a personal proper name. Rather than some royal figure named Ali, the inscription referenced El-Khalil Ali, son of Muhammad, who had been present at the site. We do not have a second independent reading confirming stonecutter Muhammad Ahmed and Master Uthman opened the monument, yet it makes perfect sense a master stonecutter would receive credit for breaking in during a large-scale casing stone looting operation. No major large-scale building projects in Cairo can be traced to that 4-year and 7-month span when all these casing stones were being carted away. Once again, I hope someone watching this video can offer new insights identifying what buildings those repurposed pyramid stones may have ended up constructing. Correcting these old mistakes has been rewarding, but even more compelling is realizing what happened during Khafre's break-in also explains the origin of Menkaure's Great Breach. The key pieces of evidence come from Pierre Belon in 1547 and John Greaves in 1639. Both men thoroughly examined Menkaure's pyramid and left descriptions indicating that large breach did not yet exist. Belon's testimony carries the most weight, and carefully translating his exact wording proves essential. The 1553 French edition of his travel account states the third pyramid is far smaller than the two that stand before it. It remains intact, showing no visible marks of ruin. The 1589 printed Latin version conveys this exact same meaning. That is a very powerful statement. The Great Breach would count as an unmissable mark of damage anyone inspecting the monument would immediately notice. John Greaves even openly argued against some of Belon's observations, because by 1639 some of Menkaure's granite casing stones had already vanished, leaving only white Tura limestone visible near its peak. Greaves actively searched for the ancient inscription Herodotus wrote about marking Menkaure's pyramid. He would absolutely not have overlooked something as obvious as the Great Breach. Of course, Greaves could have chosen not to write about it, yet spotting that huge gash would have given him another perfect point to argue Belon's description was wrong. Belon's account was accurate, though, and Greaves could not imagine the granite outer stones had been stolen so recently. So we have a Great Breach that almost certainly was not there in 1547, and very likely had not been created by 1639, yet we get no written testimony describing it until 1798. I did, however, locate a painting created by Luigi Mayer during his 1792 visit, which clearly depicts the Great Breach looking identical to how it appears today. This supports my position that Jacques Grobert was not looking at a far smaller breach back in 1798. Only one reasonable explanation fits all these facts. Belon and Greaves never saw the Great Breach because it was carved out between 1639 and 1643. During the exact same period, thieves stripped away Menkaure's Tura limestone casing stones. Let's walk through the physical evidence once more. As covered earlier, Menkaure's granite casing stones were looted before its Tura limestone outer blocks. That most likely happened between Jacques de Villemont's 1589 journey and George Sandy's visit in 1611. The people stealing those granite blocks almost certainly never uncovered Menkaure's pyramid entrance. The casing stones surrounding that entry point stayed intact and were buried under rubble, shielding them from being removed. Better still, Edward William Lane documented Menkaure's entrance location in 1820, years before Howard Weiss officially rediscovered it in 1837. Lane describes how blocks that had been torn down piled up high above where you would logically expect to find the entrance. The two stone tiers sitting right above that rubble heap still retained perfectly preserved granite casing. It was likely all the tiers below them still had their granite facing intact too. Removing some of those granite blocks would undoubtedly expose the entrance, yet you would first need to clear that massive pile of fallen stone debris, and that would represent an enormous amount of hard labor. Lane used a camera lucida tool to produce extremely precise drawings. His 1820 sketch plainly shows Menkaure's entrance was completely blocked by granite blocks that had fallen down from higher up on the pyramid face. There is simply no way the later Tura limestone thieves could have spotted Menkaure's entrance. Any attempt to clear that entryway would have meant moving those large granite blocks left behind by that earlier round of looting. Keep in mind this is the same period when stonecutters accidentally uncovered Khafre's burial chamber while they worked stripping casing stones. After confirming the other Giza pyramids concealed hidden inner chambers, those same stone looters set out searching Menkaure's pyramid, targeting the same north-face position where they had found Khafre's entry point. This explains the very strange shape and scale of the Great Breach perfectly. Its massive size has always felt too big for a routine treasure hunt, yet simultaneously too small for a full-scale pyramid demolition job. In reality, it was both. It was created by work crews already taking apart Menkaure's outer casing stones, who took advantage of their presence to hunt for its hidden entrance at the same time. That huge amount of labor only made sense because they had already successfully opened Khafre, giving them confidence they would find a matching entry inside Menkaure. Their search ultimately failed, just as Lane's 1820 writings confirm. The granite casing covering the sand-buried entrance had been ripped away before crews started quarrying the limestone outer layers. Since we can identify the crews that quarried and broke into Khafre's pyramid, we can say with confidence the Great Breach was carved out under master stonecutter Muhammad Ahmed. Ironically, this real-world sequence stands in total opposition to the narrative repeated across mainstream Egyptology books, which have uncritically recycled al-Latif al-Baghdadi's 1196 story. al-Latif's narrative claims removing pyramid stones represented backbreaking monumental work, with crews only able to shift 1 or 2 blocks each day before abandoning their demolition effort after 8 full months. In reality, removing these stones proved straightforward work for 17th century crews. The stonecutters created the Great Breach almost as a side task while harvesting limestone casing blocks to reuse elsewhere. Such a large exploratory cut was only feasible because all the manpower and heavy lifting infrastructure for moving countless pyramid stones was already assembled on site. This was a crime born from opportunity, not a deliberate ideological attack. Disappointing as it is to find al-Latif invented this specific story about Menkaure's pyramid, that does not mean everything he wrote is false. If we rejected every ancient testimony containing some made-up elements, almost no old historical accounts would remain for us to study. In certain respects, this fictional tale from al-Latif now makes far more sense once we understand its purpose. His story about Menkaure's pyramid was crafted to discourage religious extremists of his era from damaging Egypt's great pyramids. There may even sit a small kernel of truth within it. Al-Latif might have watched smaller pyramids get dismantled and wrote his warning myth to stop the same fate befalling the largest monuments. His writing largely succeeded in that goal, and we still owe him respect, even though his story managed to mislead generations of modern Egyptology researchers. Amazingly enough, John Greaves himself bears partial responsibility for preserving al-Latif's writings in the first place. Greaves worked alongside Edward Pocock to gather Arabic histories and ancient manuscripts, and Pocock located al-Latif's text inside Aleppo during 1665. Greaves even once exaggerated official requests from the English king regarding these manuscripts, writing that if he were in Constantinople, he would make sure no ships sailed home without following royal orders to collect Arabic books. So it was John Greaves who helped save al-Latif's written work, preserving a myth that Greaves's own careful field observations would later help disprove. That makes for a fitting conclusion to John Greaves's story. He dedicated himself to investigating the pyramids more thoroughly than nearly anyone before him. I keep striving to correct the historical record surrounding these pyramids as well, even when I get things wrong on my first attempt. I only wish mainstream Egyptology would follow that same example, instead of endlessly repeating old stories that never quite added up. The day you hear this real origin story for the Great Breach from a professional Egyptologist, you will know they have finally started to take their history for granted. Thanks to everyone who watched this video all the way through. Please subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Hit the like button or leave a comment as you see fit, and above all, remember to ask your friends whether they take their history for granted.